Thinking is a function of man's immortal soul. God has given an immortal soul to every man and woman, but not to any other animal or to machines. Hence, no animal or machine can think. I am unable to accept any part of this.
Here's a person who discovered the most important thing in logic, and he invented the concept of the stored program computer, and he did these wonderful things in biology and cryptography and started artificial intelligence, and he ran marathons and rode bicycles and had terrible sexual problems. And but I don't know anything about this person, and yet here's the key figure of our century, but I don't know him, and I wish I did.
Alan Mathison Turing, mathematician, codebreaker, and inventor of the computer, was born in London in 1912. His father was in the Indian Civil Service in Madras, so apart from the holidays, Alan and his older brother spent much of their childhood farmed out to guardians on the south coast and at boarding school. When he was 10, Alan was given a book which excited and focused his intellectual curiosity. One chapter was about the nature of the mind. Where we do our thinking was to fascinate Turing for most of his short life. In 1926, Turing was sent to Sherborne School. The general strike had stopped the trains, so he arrived by bike. An English public school in the 1920s was not the ideal environment for someone of Turing's particular interests and abilities.
He should do very well when he finds his métier, but meanwhile would do much better if he would try his best as a member of this school. He should have more esprit de corps.
Come on, Shirley!
Mathematics, not very good. He spends a good deal of time apparently in investigations in advanced mathematics to the neglect of his elementary work. His work is dirty. I hope he will not fall between two stools. If he is to stay at a public school, he must aim at becoming educated. If he is to be solely a scientific specialist, he's wasting his time at a public school.
At 15 and a half, Turing wrote for his mother, Sarah, a short account of Einstein's ideas.
He has now got to find the general law for the motion of bodies. It will have, of course, to satisfy the general principle of relativity. He does not actually give the law, which I think is a pity, so I will. The separation between any two events in the history...
A few months later, Turing found someone else to share his passion for mathematics and science.
Well, when he was 16, Alan Turing fell in love with another boy at Sherborne, a boy called Christopher Morecambe. It was hopeless, unrequited love. Must have been very, very painful and difficult to deal with anyway. But it did have some importance for Turing immediately because he became more communicative. He seemed to realize that there was more point to other people, to doing things, to getting on in the world, making more of a success in his academic work. And in fact, the point of his life became really to be a student with Christopher at Cambridge. Now, Christopher, in fact, did win a scholarship to Cambridge in 1929. And then it happened. Christopher suddenly died. It was in February 1930. And Turing was really quite shattered by this.
Dear Mrs. Morecambe, I want to say how sorry I am about Chris. My most vivid recollections of him are almost entirely of the kind things he said to me sometimes. Of course, I simply worshipped the ground he trod on. a thing which I did not make much attempt to disguise, I'm sorry to say. I should be grateful if you could find me sometime a little snapshot of Chris to remind me of his example and of his efforts to make me careful and neat. I shall miss his face and the way he used to smile at me sideways.
Mrs. Morecambe invited him to stay at their house, and they shared something they wanted to see in the meaning of what had happened, that it wasn't just that Christopher had died, but that somehow he lived on. Now, Alan Turing wanted to believe that Christopher Morecambe's mind somehow still survived. He wrote to Mrs. Morecambe frequently saying he felt Christopher was helping him. But you see, he didn't just want to think of this as a comforting thought, a happy, convenient belief. He had to have a scientific reason for believing this was actually true. Christopher's death inspired him to look very seriously at what modern science was saying about the nature of the mind, how the mind can be embodied in the physical world.
By the time the memorial window to Christopher Morecambe had been dedicated, Turing had been up at Cambridge for 2 years. At King's College, science and mathematics were taken seriously, and so was Turing. He was awarded a fellowship at the age of 22. Someone made up a rhyme about it. Turing must have been alluring to get made a Don so early on.
The unique thing about King's College that Turing must have found as soon as he arrived here is that it gave a particular kind of atmosphere of moral support for anyone who was homosexual, as Turing was discovering that he was. And there were well-known figures there who one reads about, people like Maynard Keynes and so forth, who were well documented in their relationships. But it wasn't just that, it's a real sense of moral seriousness, that one should be what one is, and that that's the right thing to be and the right thing to feel. But for Turing especially, he has a very fresh view of everything. He didn't see things in the conventional way. He always had to try to get a different look at everything, and that was the secret to his intellectual work. And this sense of differentness and unorthodoxy is all part and parcel of his sexuality and of his intellectual life as well.
Turing's ideas about computing machines emerged in 1935 when he solved a profound and abstruse problem in the foundations of mathematical logic, Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem. At the turn of the century, the German mathematician David Hilbert had asked, was mathematics decidable? Did there exist a definite method which could, in principle, be applied to any assertion, and which was guaranteed to produce a correct decision as to whether that assertion was true? Turing later said that it was while out running in Grantchester Meadow that he had first seen how to answer Hilbert's question.
The difficulty of the question, as a mathematical question, is not just about mathematics. You see, it's about what you mean by a method, a rule, a very vague word, a word you might use in everyday life, but not with a clearly defined meaning. Well, Alan Turing gave it a meaning, an absolutely precise meaning, because he thought, well, what would such a rule or procedure be? It would be something you could do mechanically, something you could do, let a machine work on. And now, in 1935, there were no such machines. This is just an imaginary machine. It's a machine of thought. But he made it into an absolutely definite idea, and it's the idea of the Turing machine. And I can quite see that it would be at one spot, at one moment, they could have seen how you could use this precise idea, and the whole thing would click.
Turing's paper described how any logical process could be broken down into its simplest possible components, precise sequential steps that could, in principle, be carried out by a machine. With this new definition of method as machine, he was able to formulate a logical paradox which rapidly disposed of Hilbert's question.
Only somebody totally original and uninfluenced by fashion could have written that paper. Its purpose, which was not the same as its ultimate influence, was to show that a certain task was impossible. And that, again, is very, very difficult to do, and indeed difficult to understand. Most people would think that if you the fact that people have tried to do something a lot and failed would more or less show that it was impossible. But that's not the case, because one day somebody might find how to do it. And what Alan Matt was trying to demonstrate, and succeeded in demonstrating, was that a certain task could never be performed
Well, Turing's ideas didn't just stop at the technical field of mathematical logic. His vision was much larger than that. And the thing that really drove him on was thinking, what is a mental process? What is any process by which, by thinking, we could arrive at any conclusion at all? What are our brains doing when we're thinking? And that was the argument in the background of this paper that he then wrote in 1935 and 1936. And his argument was that any mental process, whatever, assuming that the brain works in some definite way, which it must do, it must have a mechanical basis to it, then it must be something which could be simulated by a Turing machine. So he had a way of formulating what any possible mental process must be. That was his general argument. And that's the argument which looms larger and larger in his thought and is now the basis of his ideas about artificial intelligence.
In the course of solving Hilbert's problem, Turing had an insight of the greatest importance. His original conception had required a different Turing machine for each logical task, but he went on to imagine a universal machine which could read and execute the instruction set of any single Turing machine and therefore perform all possible logical tasks. He had, in effect, formulated the idea of the stored program computer.
And it didn't matter too much what the actual hardware details of the machine was, as long as you were sure that the individual steps were dead simple. So he needed some way of imagining this, so he concocted the idea of a paper tape, which had either a 0 or a 1 in each cell, and a very simple imaginary machine which just chugged back and forth, left and right, on this single paper tape, which was imagined to be infinitely extended in both directions. And what he proved was that such a simple machine, with a finite number of separate states in it, each state saying what would happen if you saw a 0 or a 1, whether you'd move left or right, and whether you would erase the symbol and replace it with the other one, or leave the symbol as it is, that's all you needed in order to compute any computable function. So it was a sort of existence proof that there could be a mechanical device which, by simply compounding and iterating all of these simple steps, could do any computation that any human being sitting at a desk and using his wits could do.
Well, it's very surprising that Turing could do this. He was a complete outsider to the field of mathematical logic. All the experts in that field in America or Germany, they'd never heard of him. He was only 23. He was a no one in the mathematical world. And yet he came up with this idea which really changed the field, was completely accepted, is now the foundation of modern computer science. But why could he do this? I mean, apart from being clever, I think the thing is he had his underlying fascination with the whole question of how to describe the mind, what the mind is, how it can be embodied in matter. And it goes back to all his wonderings at the time of Christopher Morcom's death. The answers that he tried to find then, well, he abandoned those lines of thought and came onto this new line, which used this new idea of computer logic, as we'd now think of it.
The full beauty, depth and power of Turing's revolutionary ideas would not be appreciated for years. Turing himself was about to be caught up in something far removed from the purity of mathematical logic.
A convoy at sea, one of the lifelines upon which the United Nations war effort relies. Obviously, the world's battlefronts must be kept constantly supplied with food and materials of all kinds. Admiral Dönitz and the German Navy are determined to see that these supplies don't get through, and the U-boat is certainly Hitler's most effective weapon. The U-boat, in fact, forms one of their most powerful threats to Allied victory.
The Nazi High Command was determined to avoid a repetition of the debacle of the First World War, when British intelligence routinely decoded German military signal traffic. The key was an enciphering machine called Enigma. Enigma machines were produced by the thousand and used by the entire German military system. Every U-boat carried one to receive operational orders. To stop the U-boats, Enigma had to be broken. Enigma was the most advanced enciphering device of its time. It encoded messages via an electromechanical system incorporating moving wheels or rotors. A character typed on the keyboard was sent through the rotors electrically, and the code equivalent read off an illuminated panel. The rotors changed their relative positions during encipherment to scramble the patterns a code breaker looks for. The cipher circuits also went through a plug board which switched letter pairs. Rotor and plug board configurations were changed at regular intervals, sometimes daily. The codebreaker's task was to identify the start positions of the rotors and unravel the plug board setup. The difficulties were formidable.
One can say how many different possible states there were for the machine, which was of the order of 10 raised to the power 19, in other words, a 1 followed by about 19 zeros, if my memory is correct. And I think the U-boat Enigma, which had an extra wheel, was more like 10 to the 22, approximately. Well, that gives you some idea, but it doesn't really give you a full idea, because clearly you couldn't possibly work through all those possibilities. That would be known as the British Museum attack on the system, exhaustive attack. You have to break down the attack in some way, and of course that's what we were doing.
Halfway between Oxford and Cambridge, Bletchley Park was the headquarters of the wartime British code-breaking effort. The postal address was Room 47, Foreign Office. 50 years later, the cryptanalytic machines no longer exist, and some of the methods used are still secret. Mathematicians, chess players, linguists, statisticians and engineers were recruited from all over Britain. At its height, the Bletchley operation involved 10,000 people. Alan Turing was one of the first to arrive.
He'd always been interested in codes and ciphers from school anyway, and so it's an amazing thing that after thinking about these abstract processes and methods that he was doing in thinking about the idea of a Turing machine, he found himself now real methods in a very real world, and in fact the most sophisticated methods and processes that had ever been thought of, and the most complicated mechanical ideas that probably ever been used in the fight against the German Enigma machine.
Turing's most important contribution, I think, was part of the design of the bombe, the cryptanalytic machine. He had the idea that you could use, in effect, a theorem in logic which sounds to the untrained ear rather absurd, namely that from a contradiction you can deduce everything.
It was like a joke in mathematical logic, which had this payoff in the cryptanalysis procedure and in the types of machines which they went on to build in 1940. It was always touch and go, very, very difficult. Every month, every year was a new battle with new details, new complications, new sophistications that were introduced. Turing was in the thick of that all the time and applying not just logic but really sophisticated ideas in statistics, completely new methods, new ideas for how to solve the problems which arose.
I'm not an intelligence person. I mean, not a historian. But one thing was clear. There was a period when we couldn't decipher the U-boat traffic, and the shipping losses were appalling during that period. And as soon as we got eventually on top of that U-boat traffic, it was absolutely clear what difference it was making to our successes against the U-boats and in bringing cargo into Britain.
I rather liked him, yes. I felt that he was a character. He was eccentric in the sense that he chained his mug to the radiator so that no one else would take it. He was, I suppose you'd say, eccentric in that when he was cycling into the office, he would wear an army gas mask because of his hay fever. I think other people would have been prepared to sneeze all the way, but he felt that the logical thing to do was to wear a gas mask.
I would have thought so. He was very good with people because he didn't start from any point of view except just they were people. If they were interesting, they interested him. If they weren't, they probably didn't. But I don't think people were an important feature of his life. I don't know. There must have been some people who mattered a lot to him, certainly. But machines and ideas were his real love, I believe.
Early in the war, Turing had found himself attracted to a young mathematician and Bletchley cryptanalyst called Joan Clark.
I suppose the fact that I was a woman made me different. We did do some things together, perhaps went to the cinema and so on. But certainly it was a surprise to me when he said, I think his words probably were, would you consider marrying me? But although it was a surprise, I really didn't hesitate in saying yes. And then he knelt by my chair and kissed me. Though we didn't have very much physical contact. Now, next day, I suppose we went a bit of a walk together after lunch. He told me that he had this homosexual tendency. And naturally, that worried me a bit because I did know that that was something which was almost certainly permanent. But we carried on.
And it was quite delightful. They were really sweet together. I was very upset when it broke up, and I didn't fully understand it, although Alan Turing had an attempt to explain it to me, which I think was perhaps not entirely the full explanation.
We didn't know till after World War II that Turing was homosexual. At least I did not know. There may have been some people who knew, perhaps Joan Clark knew. It could have been one reason that he gave to her for breaking off the engagement, for all I know. But it was probably a good thing that the security people didn't know, because he might then have been fired and we might have lost the war.
Well, of course, for anyone who wanted to get on with scientific research, as Turing did, the war could have been just a terrible waste of time. And in some ways it must have been for Alan Turing. But it gave him an awful lot in a very amazing way. You see, at Bletchley, you'd seen, by the end of the war, thousands and thousands of people, thousands of machines, all working away at these special, sophisticated methods, these processes that he and other people had developed. An enormous scale. Now, what he could see, as probably no one else could see, is that all these different methods and processes, all these special machines, could in fact be programs for a universal machine.
Wartime code-breaking was, of course, a life-and-death matter. Speed was everything, and towards the end of the war, cryptanalytic machines like the Colossus used electronics because they were so much faster than the older electromechanical systems. Turing saw that electronics were the key to realizing his dream of a universal machine, a real-life programmable computer. Now he wanted practical experience of working with electronics. He got his chance in 1944 when he designed a speech and ciphering machine, codename Delilah.
When I arrived, he was already started building this speech encoder, and he liked doing things himself very much. I mean, he regarded it very important that one ought to be able to do things oneself. He was fairly clumsy, and he had, to me, a very curious habit of it's called a breadboard, or actually his was called the bird's nest, because there was a great mass of wires and then condensers and resistors and so on. And he was always swapping them around to try and improve something or other, you see. And so he would take the soldering iron. He always soldered with a high-tension left arm. I can't think why. So my first memory, actually, of coming to the shop is there was this rather scruffy-looking civilian with no tweed jacket, bent over the bird's nest, and every now and then he'd go, oh, oh.
In fact, Delilah worked well but was never used. The war was over. For a while, it looked as if Turing was going to get what he really wanted. He was recruited by the National Physical Laboratory, the NPL, to design what would have been the world's first actual universal machine, the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE.
I think he thought that when he went to the NPL, he was going to make an electronic brain, rather as he had made, or I'd made for him, this secure speech device. And he spent several months working out the basis of the ACE and got it to the stage at which now you start making things. And at that stage, he sort of metaphorically was rolling up his sleeves and saying, right, now I'll get out my American Beauty and get down to making this brain. And the NPL said, oh, no, you don't. You're the sort of chap who tells us how we make one, but we have experts and we have contractors who make things for us. And he rather took offence at this, so he told me, that they'd employed him to make a brain and they weren't letting him do it.
His vision was of a computer and programming which could simulate mental processes. It seemed to him that the NPL were more interested in a mere calculating machine. He took up running seriously, possibly out of frustration with the snail's pace of progress on the ACE. The truth was that the eccentric brilliance, boldness and originality which had made Turing a national asset during the war were not appreciated in peacetime Britain. Bureaucratic delay at the NPL, obstruction and political rivalry all conspired against him. A pilot version of the ACE was built. It took 5 years, but Turing was long gone. He had left the NPL and gone back to Cambridge. Once again, King's accepted him and appreciated him for what he was. He renewed his friendship with Robin Gandy, now a Cambridge graduate student.
He lent me a book, a mathematical book, and as I took it, a page fluttered out of it, which was a photograph of 2 page boys at a royal wedding. And someone else was with us, and he just said, oh, yes, you find pretty pictures like that in my books. Then the next day he came to me and said, I think you ought to know. And he was very relieved to find one. I mean, I'd known a lot of homosexuals in my time, and that I wasn't in the least bit shocked or didn't think it extraordinary. And, of course, that made a much closer bond in our friendship.